Hey everyone, welcome to Data Umbrella's webinar. I'm going to do a brief introduction. Zoe will do her presentation and we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please post it in the chat. This will be recorded. A little bit about Data Umbrella. We're a community for underrepresented persons in data science, and we are a nonprofit organization. This is the team behind the scenes that makes it all happen. We have a nice team that is in a few different countries. We have a code of conduct, and we thank you for helping to make this a welcoming, friendly community for everyone. There are various ways to support Data Umbrella. The first and foremost is to follow our code of conduct. And if you'd like to share our events with others, that would be great as well. And there are other ways that you can contribute to Data Umbrella. We have a bunch of open source projects, such as doing video timestamps, for instance, for this event, and that helps people find the video. We have a website, we have a PyMC Sprint website as well, we have a blog, and we have a data events board. You can also support our nonprofit by making a donation. We are on Open Collective, and we are also in the Benevity platform, which means that your company will often match. Once you make a donation, they'll match dollar for dollar. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have quite a vast library of open source and data science presentations. We have a lot of playlists. So one of them is career advice, as well as data viz, data science beginners, contributing to open source, many playlists. Check them out. We also have a monthly newsletter, dataumbrella.substack.com, and we aim to get one newsletter out per month. This is a scan where you can scan our code to find our most commonly used links. We use Big Marker as a platform here, and we have closed captioning. So if you click on CC at the top, we can get live transcription of the presentation. We also have an online suggestion box, which the link is, I'll share the link in the chat, but if you have any suggestions for future event topics, or you'd like to speak at an event, or just give any feedback or technical issues, let us know. Our upcoming events on September 26th, which is a week from today, we're going to have Into the Rabbit Hole, debugging in Python. And on October 3rd, we're going to have Introduction to OpenRefine for data cleaning and reconciliation. Today's talk is an overview of information security. Zoe Braiterman is an information security consultant and researcher. You can find her on GitHub and Twitter at zbraiterman, and you can also find her on LinkedIn. And with that, I'm going to go on mute and hand over the microphone and the screen to Zoe.
Thank you so much, Reshama. Let me get up my screen. Wonderful. So as Reshama had said, I'm going to discuss an overview of information security in terms of what it entails, why it's important, and how to enter the field of information security. So who am I? I'm Zoe Braiterman. I'm an information security consultant, as Reshama had said. I am also Chief Information Officer of Mutual Knowledge Systems, a startup that does a lot of Web3 solutions and consulting and, including, heavy security. So why information security and what is the overarching goal? So really protecting what organizations value and, assets, including logging credentials, infrastructure and system components to make sure that they're not susceptible to harm by an attacker or by an accident. Sometimes people accidentally misuse certain credentials because they're underinformed or just an oversight. there are various there are various scenarios in which that can happen without malicious intent per se, but nonetheless it harms the system. Personally identifiable information, depending on the regulations, that could be email, birthdays, a variety of other information that can bring people's identities to public availability when unintended, and also access to funds, whether traditional or crypto. So there's the concept of CIA Triad, and CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And confidentiality is making sure that sensitive information is protected and not exposed to those who do not require it and should not have access to it. Integrity is making sure that certain information is not tampered with, altered, or affected in any other way, and that it remains in the format and structure and location as it should be. Availability is making sure that information systems are functional and operating in a timely fashion and as needed for the organization to carry out operations that rely on those system components. So one example that comes to mind is that so my lighting in my apartment relies on a remote control to turn on and off. And I accidentally misplaced that. Luckily, I have the lovely window lighting, but because I misplaced it, I don't have access to my internal lighting system until I find it. But, perhaps an attacker in that sort of situation would purposely take that remote control from me, and so that I wouldn't have light. If my not having light were somehow of value to that attacker. And one other important concept is red and blue teaming. So red teaming is thinking like an attacker, simulating certain possible attacks that might be known. And a lot of those simulations and attack types are based on extensive research. There are a lot of very specific resources and frameworks. For example, you might want to look into MITRE, capital M, capital I, capital T, capital R, capital E, and certain other commonly known vulnerabilities for which one would test using specific methodologies, and in terms of when to apply them in what situation for what kind of project or system. Think about what an attacker might want, might value, might prioritize, and then plan the project accordingly. And the blue team and purple team. So the blue team is implementing controls, monitoring for and responding to certain types of potential attacks and vulnerabilities, and making sure that the proper controls are in place to keep those assets and those systems protected from those types of attacks. And they work together extensively, really trying to come up with the best solution for the organization. So another aspect of information security is governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. So conducting risk assessments and making sure that organizations are taking proper measures to protect their organization and meet compliance requirements. So good security, as really any security professional that I know who's passionate will say that security goes well beyond compliance, and that meeting compliance is the bare minimum. But being able to make sure that organizations are meet the password minimum requirements, for example, for users and for web applications, such that they make it more difficult to brute force. And for that reason, among others, the researchers decided that these were the standards that should be followed. So somebody needs to go through each system and make sure that there are no oversights, because everyone within an organization is busy carrying out their roles and responsibilities. So making sure that each of these regulatory requirements are put into place and are properly implemented, and also the awareness and training component, which in of itself is requirement, making sure that each member of an organization really understands how they maintain security in carrying out their daily tasks. And here are just some examples of regulatory frameworks and also standards and requirements that must be met. And it varies for certain types of systems. There are network controls that must be put into place. Also business practices. And so there really is a lot. There really is a lot. And some of how to actually implement it is very nuanced, depending. So I think ultimately the only needed things to start your learning path and career entry into information security is the passion to protect systems and people, and make sure that systems, again, are available, are tamper-proof, or as much as possible, and confidential. And knowledge of your type of system is very important, if not necessary, to enter. So, for example, if you're going to be work in application security, protecting web applications, then you will want to have developer experience and understand what it's like to be a developer as far as their daily lives, such that you can communicate with them, but also to understand, for example, how to input validation and what that's like from a developer's perspective, and then break that down per framework and be able to understand what it entails and what they should be looking for, and be able to remind developers that they should be doing that. And in addition to being in charge of patching and defense protocols. And lifelong learning. So there are a lot of tooling that are, constantly being developed in order to use it to protect systems. So, for example, for GRC, as I'd mentioned, there are frameworks as to how to map certain controls and certain system technical measures to meet certain requirements. And for red teaming, there are specific frameworks and methodologies, both in terms of the methodology, but also, in terms of the tools. So, for example, there are tools that specifically allow you to brute force passwords or perform SQL, structured query language injection, or something else specific. There are also specific tools for scanning applications, scanning code in various ways. And there's a lot. I mean, just learning what each of these tools do is a very, very exciting, in my opinion, rabbit hole in of itself, to see the methodologies. So, for example, software composition analysis versus dynamic application security testing, and what that entails for various roles. how these tools might integrate into the software development life cycle, etc. And at the end of the day, it's about just starting somewhere. I believe that, you know, there was an Alice in Wonderland quote, just start at the beginning, and then seek mentorship throughout. And while I'm, you know, speaking about mentorship, one great thing is to join communities that include a bunch of mentors who are there to help you and be with you throughout the way. I think also teaching and mentoring as other people have questions, whether they're newer for you or just from a different background, that in of itself is great practice. Volunteering, as I mentioned, I volunteer with OWASP. One example of a great diversity-specific organization for cybersecurity is BBWIC, Breaking Barriers Women in Cybersecurity, who's led by my amazing friend Asta Sani. And she gives free trainings, is an expert in multiple cybersecurity domains, and it's also a global community. So I highly recommend checking that out. Started out as a lean-in circle, but spun very quickly out into its own not-for-profit. And also checking out YouTube videos. I think a lot of the best learning resources are free, because the cybersecurity community, a bunch of researchers and practitioners, they really value open source because of the transparency, in addition to the learning opportunities and understanding how valuable it is for as many people as possible to be trained to help defend against cybercrime. And so here are some examples of YouTube channels. I've broken it down by red teaming to more on the defensive side. And so, and there are many other examples. So again, feel free to reach out to me afterward if you'd like to be directed toward anywhere specific. And yeah, I mean, that went a lot quicker than Reshama. Are there any questions?
Yes. The first question is, can you explain about internal controls with an example?
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. So one example is, you know, a configuration for what types of usernames or passwords are accepted as inputs to a system, whether it be a web application, whether it be system administration for an entire at the network level for the entire members of an organization, and making sure that those configurations are set to what they should be as far as the standards go, and that they're, you know, that everyone is in the organization is following what they are, assuming that it's at the organization level. There are checklists and cheat sheets for various very, you know, specific sets of controls, and some of them are specific to the type of system, kind of more generally, but there are specific sets of controls that you can kind of break down as checklists. So for example, for specific AWS services, they will have that documentation available. And there are also open source projects for those, for folks on a budget, small companies, for example. There are also startups who specifically try to help small to medium sized businesses to be able to do these things on a budget. But OWASP, in addition to a community, has open source tools, for example. So they have, for example, dependency tracker and projects to track dependencies and be able to monitor that and have the output necessary for that. There's also a big open source dynamic application security testing tool that's completely open source and free for individuals to use. It is called Z-Attack Proxy Zap. So if you want to check that out, I'd highly recommend playing around with that. And then, sorry, that that was a little bit of a stray from the controls, but I just realized that while I'm still on the slide. But I do. There are checklists. If you go to NIST, as I mentioned, there are specific National Institute of Standards and Technology. There are certain checklists available for understanding the controls. Certain system-specific benchmarks. Sometimes you need to pay, but sometimes you can kind of find a workaround depending on what certain researchers might have made publicly available. But yeah, I mean, a lot of committed individuals in their own time put together checklists and guides on how to implement certain controls and list what the specific controls are, as well as how to think about them as categories. So, for example, the OWASP Top 10 Proactive Controls is a guide on what specific controls will help protect against commonly known web application vulnerabilities. And if you look on the website for that, and I can share that afterward as well, is it also includes links and references toward specific examples and other useful controls. And also, if you just do a Google search or a search within OWASP.org, for example, then you can typically find specific sets of controls or guides on how to implement them. And joining a Slack channel, for example, you can ask project leaders or other people struggling with the same issues across various organizations. And that's especially useful to someone like myself who consults independently. So I can't necessarily ask internally, actually, most of the time. So you heavily rely on these things, doing independent consulting and independent researching. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. We have another question, which is, what are the primary steps to break into the cybersecurity industry?
Ooh, great question. So if you somehow have a sense of what you want to do and what area you want to enter, then I would try to seek specific mentorship there, joining certain organizations. So for example, I didn't mention this, but if not web applications, if something more on the regulatory side, for example, you might want to join ISC Squared or ISACA, which are other organizations. I would also search certain resources on YouTube. Search if you go to the NIST website, try to search some of the checklists, which might give you an idea, and then searching those kinds of things will help you formulate the right questions to ask the right people and the right subject matter experts for a given area. And then if you put together a blog post based on what you learn, or probably several blog posts, or show an example of how you broke into an intentionally vulnerable web application, those are available as well. And what you did to patch that in a practice setting, and you put that together, as part of your references, your portfolio, then that can be very helpful. Just being able to explain what a certain vulnerability is, what it implies for the system and the users, and how you would go about fixing it. And any sort of examples of that are good for a portfolio. And also listing specific skills. Once you learn certain tools, as I'd mentioned, Z-Attack Proxy, for example, then once you've learned some of those, then put that on your resume under the skills section and submit those to job applications, as well as the portfolio. Any volunteer work also is very valued. And I know that's the case with various areas of technology, but potentially more so for certain areas of security. I don't want to generalize like that, but I think it might be the case. But there are also, open source security tools. So if you make a contribution to that, that's a great thing to try and show. And a lot of project leaders are very, very open. And I know that Reshama has been a huge leader in open source contributions within data science. But you can also check out certain open source security projects. And if you're not technical, then there are guides as well that you might be able to contribute to. There are specific calls where they have open working groups, and you can listen in and then hopefully eventually contribute. And you'd be shocked, especially with those, if you have any business or social sciences backgrounds as well, then a lot of these leaders really like to hear from you as far as your perspective or just writing abilities that might help contribute and just getting into the discussion. I think being bold in that capacity. And I'm very introverted, but it's easier to be bold. It's easier a lot. It's much easier for me to get involved and be bold, as I say, when it comes to contributing to projects, because it's not public speaking right off the bat. Not everyone does that. There are definitely amazing technical trainers who speak at conferences and evangelize for a living. And I'd mentioned a few there, Asta Sani and Vandana Verma. They're great public speakers, but I don't know if I doubt they weren't born that way, but they are, but not everyone even has to get there. So I think that the information security community, or at least certain subsets of it, really, really hardcore values diversity in a variety of ways, rather than just, again, meeting some sort of checkbox, because they really need all the help that they can get to secure systems and to make the world better. There are certain events called Capture the Flag events and platforms where you can practice finding certain types of vulnerabilities. And the red teaming YouTube channels that I had recommended, some of them include Capture the Flag examples, so you can see how, what it looks like for somebody else who's an expert to be finding those vulnerabilities. And then once you get to participating in one on your own, you have a better sense of practicing. And patience is a virtue. You're not going to find bugs right away, both because you're unfamiliar with the toolings or potentially the types of systems as well. But I think if you don't find those types of challenges fun, then you're going to get too frustrated to get good at it, per se, and which is fine. Again, there are so many areas of security that some of which are not, are barely technical at all. And So, but I mean, like what you naturally, enjoy and find interesting should definitely help guide you in your decision of where to enter.
So we have another question, which is any directions on where you can find volunteer work in cyber?
Ooh, so if you go to conferences, or specific conference sites, if you go to OWASP.org, then they have conferences. Sometimes they take volunteers and give them discounts, but a lot of times they're volunteers who are members of OWASP. But I would, look into that. It's worth asking. The community is very friendly, but show up to a local meetup of your chapter and see how you can volunteer there and become integrated with the community there. And I kind of like that approach better, actually more than kind of, because it's more ongoing and consistent rather than just one conference. So it's easier to keep connections and really feel like you're part of it. Other conferences, so there are diversity-specific conferences, such as Women in Cybersecurity, WISES, Diana Initiative, some other organizations. I'm not sure for the more, compliance oriented, how, I mean, depending on who the chapter leader, they could, some of them are more kind of open than others, as far as sharing resources, but they don't necessarily have a Slack channel per se, so it's a little bit different. So for example, the extent of my involvement with those types of organizations are limited to local chapter leaders who have been my mentors and I personally know, and, get invitations, for example, to further volunteer at other conferences or events, or meetups. So that depends, but I think, again, because of the Slack channel, the openness, and the project oriented, I really do recommend starting with OWASP and seeing what conferences might be recommended. And if you ask, anyone within these organizations, they might have more specific recommendations on conferences or other volunteer opportunities. But yeah, that's a great opportunity. And just the attitude that you're showing by saying you want to volunteer is something that people in the industry will really value. Trust me. So good job on that.
Well, it seems like that was a great question and a great answer. Our next question is how to move to GRC from SOC. Is it possible to do that without a certification? As I think hands-on is important to do certifications. Is this wrong? And if you could also explain what GRC means and SOC means, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. So facilitating those risk management, risk assessment, and applications of certain compliance requirements. That's essentially GRC, at least, someone who's highly specialized might be able to give you a far better answer than that. But in a nutshell, that's it. SOC, SOC, so there's Security Operations Center, which includes certain specific tooling, such as if you heard of SIEM, SIEM, security incident and events management, tool like Splunk that you will want to, that essentially monitors for certain types of security alerts and events that help shed light to to incidents that might have occurred on the system. So that's one aspect. And then, you map those types of events to certain controls that must be met to achieve security practices and compliance. That's a great question, but they definitely work hand in hand if you think about the entire project scope of finding and identifying, fixing, and preventing in the future against those types of threats. I hope that answers your question.
So Zoe, for someone who's new in cybersecurity, what would you say is the first certification to get?
So that still depends, but I would start maybe something like the CompTIA or Network Plus, or one of those certifications that are more IT focused, but I guess heavy networking implications. There's also for red teaming, there's the OSCP. There is the certified ethical hacking. Certified ethical hacker certification is more basic than the OSCP. So especially if you're unsure that you want to go that route, then I would start with that. It's not as commonly valued as the OSCP, but because it's significantly less advanced. But it's certainly a start, especially for learning, and the costs, I'm pretty sure, are significantly lower. So again, that helps, especially if you're uncertain, and also just in terms of learning curve. And eventually there's the CISP, which is, I admittedly don't know offhand what these specific acronyms are, but Certified Information System Security Professional, I'm pretty sure. But that's something offered through, at least training is offered through that ISC squared organization that I'd mentioned. And there are specific management certifications as well if you want to go that route. I think there's the CISM. There are others. So as far as credentialing, it really depends what route you want to go. But just remember that the certifications are not necessarily, like, don't necessarily equate certifications with courses or learning paths per se, because at least for entry level roles, some of them will accept you without a certification. Some will, but it really depends on what you're going for. I think that a lot of my colleagues as well will say that requiring a certification for entry level role is pretty ridiculous, because it doesn't facilitate inclusion as it should, and B, how is anyone supposed to know? And it's expensive, and a lot of what's actually done and applied is on the job and has to do with how well you solve a problem kind of in real time as things come up. And the training for any of the certifications requires continued education to keep up anyway. So yeah, it's good to keep in mind what certifications make sense. If you go and you find, for example, an open curriculum for any of those, once you decide, then that's good to study. Questions from those will definitely be useful in any sort of interview or in speaking with a client. The concepts are in those certification exams for good reason. But Yeah, I mean, definitely, be wary of your budget, be wary of your goals. And I would say either way, start talking to people doing what you want to do early on, because ultimately that's just the most sustainable thing.
So thank you, Zoe. The next question is, and I guess it's more of a just a clarification. So red team are people who coordinate attacks to see if the security is good. Is that right? And then blue team defends the attacks at a company. Is that right?
Essentially, at a high level, that's correct. Yes.
And then what is the purple team again?
So purple team are, kind of the intermediary between the two. So, for example, understanding how to coordinate between the attacks and defenses. So, for example, if a certain vulnerability is found, what that entails for, implementing countermeasures, what that, entails for defending against that moving forward, and also kind of coordinating costs as well, coordinating budget, coordinating risk and prioritization.
That's great. Thank you. And a question that I've had for a while is, how did you get into cybersecurity?
I guess it was kind of by accident. So I've always been like a STEM kind of geek, but I did study business and sociology. So the concept of, using tech for A, good, and B, thinking from that, criminology and leadership perspective and management perspective as well, just was very exciting, concept for me. And then I started doing certain CTF type challenges, and I just found it very, very engaging. And it's so interdisciplinary. It's a great way to meet and work with a lot of different interesting people with different backgrounds, um, different perspectives on life. And the fact that it's open means you don't just um, meet one type of person. And I just can't emphasize enough how awesome that is. And so one example is Philip Wiley, whose X profile I'd shared on this last slide. So he had started as a pro wrestler, and he has since written, I think, 2 books on red teaming and has mentored so many people. And he has this picture when he's explaining his entry to the career of him wrestling a bear. And I guess he just took that kind of, fighting tactics and methodology and started to do that to attack and ethically, for the greater good, attack systems and find weaknesses and disclose for the greater good. So you find a lot of these stories, which is just so interesting in itself, and just meeting these people, having these friends. It's just, they're all super, super passionate. And so I think ultimately, it really was the people for me. I know that was a long-winded route to the answer to that question. I apologize.
No, that's great. I saw that. I think I saw on LinkedIn that you're like ranked type quite high in hacking, right? Hacking skills.
Oh, yeah. So they have these open learning platforms. So there are platforms like Try Hack Me, where on your own time you can have one of their built-in virtual machines and practice. And certain challenges are developed by certain contributors. And I guess some are the staff and some are volunteers, because they give you the option to develop a room, as they call it. And so yeah, so really any technical practice lab will require you to have some sort of virtual machine. So, as far as so that the platform TryHackMe is if you can afford the subscription to that platform, I recommend it because they set the virtual machines up for you in the cloud, so you don't have to maintain it, and you can just focus on what happens when you try certain things. And it's, rather than a full capture the flag, as I'd mentioned before, that it's more, small, specific learning, hands-on learning, and challenges. But they also have applied rooms where it's kind of like a mini CTF, but it's not, at least for the most part, it's not as extensive as an entire CTF. Either way, it's mostly challenge by challenge. Some of them are quite complex, but it's fun. It's gamified, but they also have conceptual learning. For example, an overview of GRC, and they have various paths. So if you're willing to spend a little bit, then I would try those first. And then if you like a specific path, a specific learning path within that platform, then you can go for the certification that's associated with the path if you'd like. But in general, like scenario-based understanding is the most applied way to go about it, to see specific instances of what can go wrong and how to fix it.
So would you say, Zoe, that sort of doing these capture the flag events and getting into that might be like a good place to start for security?
Yeah, at least if you have some, technical knowledge and experience. So if you know certain basic Linux commands, then that's a great way to start. And a lot of it, you'll just see a parallel. For example, file permissions, just understanding, file permissions, for example, and access controls is, the basis for understanding different privilege escalation attack techniques, where an attacker could gain privileges and that they should not have, and exploit that for their benefit. So yeah, I think as long as you have that, I think, again, if possible, eliminate, do something to eliminate the unless you're starting out as a sysadmin, start with something that's already set up as a VM. Just there's more certainty, and then you can skip to the challenge rather than also making sure that the VM is up to date and properly configured. But even if you use, for example, VirtualBox at the beginning, which is free, then that could be good. But sometimes it's slower than I would like to really just get to the challenge. But yeah, just learning by doing, definitely the not seeking perfection mindset is extremely important. And supposedly, and I wouldn't be shocked if this were, accurate, It does definitely seem and feel fact-based, but that women are more kind of perfectionists and less likely to just start doing something. But I would just view it as fun to start, so you don't like have some sort of preconceived notion in mind and you just start playing around. Have that mindset, because just being able to see what can happen is a lot more real and valuable than just theory and like hypotheticals and concepts. And the fact that a lot of these opportunities are free and open is very, very important, both as like both for companies and society to get the best talent and the best assistance, but also for learners. So I mean, think about the whole concept of an internship per se is you try a job and you see if you like it, not just by studying it conceptually. So it's kind of like that opportunity, but it's free, and you can, depending on how you set it up, you can do at least most of it on your own time. So yes, yeah, great point, Reshama. Thank you. I do think that's probably the ideal start.
So Zoe, thank you so much. There aren't other questions, so I think we can end it. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to present to the community. It's something, I've just started looking into cybersecurity, and I think one distinct difference that I see in cybersecurity compared to other fields is that doing this hands-on stuff is from the beginning, whereas, when you're doing like studying whatever data science or statistics, which I studied, it's like all theoretical, and it's like many years later before you work, hands-on a problem. So I think that's really, really cool with cybersecurity. All right, and with that, I am going to end the webinar.
Thank you so much.